Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of ESL Talk. We are your hosts. I'm Faye.
And this is Daniel. Last week, we reviewed different options available for ESL teachers and how they can expand and develop themselves into other areas beyond the traditional ESL roles.
And today we will be discussing the topic of inclusivity in the ESL classroom. When it comes to our students, how can we provide inclusivity for all of them?
Right, yeah. How can we make them feel safe, supported, and nurtured during our classes? And how can we provide them opportunities and an atmosphere where they can flourish? So I'm really excited to be able to speak to our guest today, Tyson Seburn. Tyson is a researcher, author, and EMI lecturer and assistant academic director at New College, University of Toronto.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing more on his research and expertise on identity and inclusivity in the ESL classroom.
Yeah, it's a great topic, and it's something that I think we all should consider as ESL teachers and educators. I think even when teaching one-on-one or small groups, even bigger classes, this is an area of teaching that we all need to think about when it comes to our teaching approach.
Yeah, that's actually a really important consideration. So let us start today by talking about our thoughts and ideas on these topics of inclusivity and identity. So Daniel, in a teaching context, what does inclusivity and identity mean to you?
Yeah, this is a great question. The majority of the teaching that I do is with adult learners. I do have a few younger learners, but generally when it comes to inclusivity, it's making sure your classes, the way you teach, the materials that you put together, that they're obviously applicable to everyone and that they try to include everyone. So for some of the classes I teach, I have a lot of international students, and I'll always make efforts to include something from their language, from their culture, maybe from their backgrounds, because we want to make sure that everyone feels represented and included within that class. So I'll always make an effort to do that. In terms of identity, I guess, as an ESL learner, there's an identity, but obviously as a human, most importantly, they have an identity as well. So it's trying to create a safe place where students can feel like they're free to talk, about whatever they want. That if there are some things that maybe are different from the culture that they're used to, that we can explain those and we can kind of address any misconceptions. And obviously, in terms of identity, that they feel like it doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, what their background is, that they're welcome and that they have an opportunity to be nurtured and to flourish as well. What about for you, Faye?
Yeah, I feel like it's sometimes it's so easy to just stick to the traditional materials that I find often tend to want to not only teach English, but kind of teach the culture of English speaking countries, in a way. And it's so easy to just stick to that and just be teaching students what it's like to be Canadian, or what Canadians are like, or what our culture is like, what our Western culture is like, and we just lose a lot of opportunity to include our students and to personalize the lesson
Right.
for them and make them feel like their identity also matters. So I
Mhm.
always tried to, whenever teaching a lesson that's a little bit more about Canada or a little bit more about customs that we have here, just trying to get their input and what their culture is like, and just comparing with what their own experiences are like. And also in terms of identity and trying to, like you said, trying to make students feel like that's a safe space for them to be who they are. I've had like students of all different cultures and backgrounds, and even gender identities differed. And a lot of students also sometimes come from cultures where this is sometimes not talked about.
Mm.
Even like things like same-sex marriage might not even be legal in their countries. So
Right.
I always try to, when I know I have a very diverse group, at the beginning of our session together, just make it very clear that we're all going to be respectful to each other, that everybody is welcome, and just tolerance is key, right? And
Yeah.
just making that, opening that up for students to know that they will be respected and accepted, but also that the opposite will not be tolerated, right?
Right. Yeah, that key word that you've just touched on is respect and mutual respect. I think that
Mhm.
starts with us as the teacher, kind of setting that kind of foundation for the rest of the
Mhm.
classes and kind of saying early on, this is who we are as a group, this is who we are as a class, and we need to be aware and respectful and mindful of those differences. And as long as we discuss, those differences and we talk about them in the right way, then that's fine. And that's actually a great way to learn as well.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So for you, Faye, when you're teaching groups on your courses, how do you ensure inclusivity and that your students can be themselves in an ESL setting? This kind of, I guess, comes into materials a little bit more, but what's your approach, Faye?
Yeah. So like I said, just trying to at the beginning, very beginning, establish that safe space and just making sure that all of the students' opinions are valid. And if things come up, like certain comments that are a little bit tone deaf for cultural
Yeah,
reasons,
yeah.
or homophobic, or even racist comments,
Hmm.
I try to turn that into a teachable moment, but also like showing them that that's not up for debate. The idea that being gay is a sin, that's not something we're going to discuss, because if we're in Canada, that's not the way things work here. I usually use that as
Hmm.
a, like, I'd say, as a way to establish, like, this is where you are in Canada. This gay marriage has been legal for years. We have people of all different backgrounds. We have to respect each other and all that. And but also trying not to be so, I'd say, aggressive towards that student that has that opinion, because they might come from a culture where they've never even talked about it before, and you want to
Mm.
educate them, right? So
Yeah.
trying to open their minds to that, and while at the same time making sure that maybe somebody in the class is, let's say, queer, or somebody who is feeling oppressed, and you want to make
Hmm.
them feel safe.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a balance. So it can be quite tricky, but it is things that have come up in classes with me for me
Yeah.
before. And I've had students come up to me afterwards thanking me for, let's say, like talking about it, and, let's say, defending them, or
Yeah.
things like that. So I guess it's just being tactful is really important, but at the same time, there's like a limit to how much we can tolerate, and once you cross that line of respect, like you mentioned,
Mhm.
things need to be talked about, and they need to be addressed,
Yeah,
right?
I would
What do you
say
think?
so. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think I think you've touched on some really important points. And when it comes to my lesson planning as well, I'll always try to give students options so that they can talk about things that matter to them and that are important to them as well. So if
Mm-hmm.
they do feel comfortable, talking about gender or sexuality or ethnicity or whatever it could be, then they have that
Mm-hmm.
option to do that. So for example, in some of my courses, I offer things like we talk about controversies. What are controversies? Are they the
Mm-hmm.
same in different places? And that kind of leads to some really interesting discussions and some really interesting responses as well.
Mm-hmm.
So giving students the option, I think, is great so that they can actually, talk about what matters to them. That's
Yeah.
one approach that I would take. And then again, like you said, setting your standards very early. And then when things do
Mm-hmm.
come up, don't look at it as a problem, look at it as a discussion and
Mm-hmm.
use that to kind of, elicit maybe a wider response from the rest of the group and
It's
and
an opportunity, right?
yeah, because I
Open that
think
up. Yeah.
I think for some students, not that their beliefs or what they were taught when they were younger, it's not necessarily wrong. It's just different. And again, we have to just think about the culture and the society that we're in right now, because even what students may think when they think of Canada or the US or the UK, those stereotypes or those beliefs
Mm-hmm.
might be actually outdated. So,
Yeah.
it's our job to kind of bring it up to the right level as well.
Yeah, that's true. Now, when it comes to teaching your university classes or one-to-one lessons, does this change for you at all? Or do you do anything differently to promote this inclusivity?
Yeah, one to one, you can kind of be a little bit more relaxed in terms of your discussion because you've built that level of trust with that student on a one to one
Mm-hmm.
basis.
Mm-hmm.
So if things do come up, you can talk about them more frankly, I think, and a little bit more, openly.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be a little bit more tactful in a university class setting or in an adult class setting because, again, you don't know how someone might be feeling when you broach a certain topic, or you don't know someone's experience or what they've gone through in their life. So
Mm-hmm.
it's again creating an environment where they can share that if they wish, but if they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to, then that's also fine as well. So
Mm-hmm.
just and again, we don't like it, like we will probably get into later, we don't have to hammer home certain points and certain issues. We can
Mm-hmm.
just touch on them and include them as a part of a lesson, as one section of it. It doesn't have to be what the whole class or the whole course becomes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that these are some different things that you might not know about or you might not be used to or that you might not
Mm-hmm.
have seen or heard about before. So I think that's a really important approach to take, and that also helps build that rapport with your learners. and then hopefully leads to them asking questions, because that's the best way that students are going to learn. So if they have that opportunity to ask questions, and again, it's a nice way for them to kind of know more and learn more and feel more comfortable in that setting as well.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So Faye, did you ever consider these issues when you first started teaching? Obviously in Brazil, it was quite not that long ago, but a few years ago. So did you think about these issues at the start of your teaching career? And if they did change, when and why did this change?
Yeah, I don't think I did it early on, but I ended up learning from experience. First of all, I had a couple of coworkers who ended up actually having issues with students because they were gay teachers and other teachers that maybe the topic came up in their class and students started making homophobic comments, and then those teachers felt really uncomfortable because they were being personally attacked, and often the students didn't realize it, or maybe they did and they did it on purpose. And I think I remember that was the first time I ever thought about how that could affect somebody directly like that. A teacher and a student could not feel safe maybe in their classes because of that. And I remember after that, like we had sort of a talk, all the staff talked, and we talked about what could be done and how we could approach it and what we could all do as a group, to tackle these issues. And from then on, I just kind of made more of a point to be very clear about what was and wasn't tolerated in my classes, because I always taught adult learners as well.
Yeah, when I started teaching in South Korea, it's a very different society to what I was used to in the UK. And again, those kind of issues were kind of, I got some strange looks when I brought them up, and maybe people were like a little bit confused. But again, I tried to educate and be open and be kind of showing that there are differences in the way that people live and the choices that people make, and that's fine and that's okay. But definitely there was some resistance, but that early experience helped me to kind of realize that it is important to talk about these things and to address them, and to obviously make sure that our planning process and our approach includes that within that as well.
Yeah, it was interesting because, like you said, I started teaching almost 15 years ago, and it was in Brazil. It was very, very different from what the world is like now, but also from what Canada was like 15 years ago. Because when I moved to Canada, that was a huge difference between the way people behaved and people's beliefs and all that, and people were just able to make comments like that. Like in Brazil, it was common to just use the word gay or a synonym to the word like faggot was like super common for people to use, And when I moved here, I'm like, okay, so good. People don't use those words negatively. They don't. So that was already a huge difference. So when I moved here, I felt like I had more to back me up. Like in class, when the topic would come up, I could basically say that's not okay in Canada. People do not talk like that in Canada, and this is why. And this is the law. And whereas in Brazil, I felt like students felt like this was up for discussion. Whereas in my mind, it wasn't up for discussion. The fact that you should respect others. So in a way, we have it a bit easier here. But at the same time, it's easy to just get in that comfort zone and then don't touch on that, and don't bring it up. I feel like we do have that duty to educate our students in that sense as well, especially when we're working with students who are going to immigrate and live in Canada or live in the UK and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's already been a really insightful discussion to open up the first part of our episode today.
Yeah, let's now hear from Tyson, who will share his knowledge and experience in these areas of inclusivity and identity. Hello, Tyson. We're very excited to welcome you to ESL Talk.
Hi there. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, we're very excited. And we've already begun sharing some of our own experiences and ideas on the topics of inclusivity, identity for ESL teaching. And we're really looking forward to hearing your insights and all about your knowledge in these areas.
Well, I hope I have something good to say.
I'm sure you will.
Sure you will, yeah. So Tyson, could you just briefly share with us your teaching journey so far and your motivations for getting into teaching initially?
Sure. I started a long time ago. So in 1998, I had graduated from my undergrad at university. I did a philosophy degree. And that didn't seem to really be leading to too much work. And so I was trying to figure out really what I wanted to do with my life. And of course, throughout my entire life, I liked teaching, or I liked the idea of being a teacher. But in terms of having like a teachable or going to teachers college, it didn't really seem like the most opportune plan. And so I worked in a private computer college in London, Ontario, immediately after I graduated. So that gave me a little bit of a sense of what it was like to be in the classroom. And then I didn't really enjoy computer teaching so much. And a friend of mine had already gone to Seoul to teach English, and I decided to follow her there, basically. And so that's what I did. And I spent about 6 years in Seoul at private language schools, and then at a university, and did some private tutoring, things like that, the sort of typical thing you would do over there.
Yep.
And that gave me, a good foundation of writing materials or supplementing materials and sort of getting my feet wet in terms of teaching. And then I came back to Canada in 2003 and worked at private language schools here, kind of did some managerial stuff. Then I worked at a book distributor for ELT, and eventually landed in the role that I'm in now, which is at the University of Toronto in an EAP program. And so I think sort of each one of these roles basically taught me something about being inclusive or not, maybe, and gave me some experience with regards to teaching materials and how to write materials for a wider group of people to use. So sort of that's kind of the trajectory I've been on.
Oh, yeah. It's a lot of varied experience, which must have really helped you. But what really first appealed to you about studying this topic deeper, like the topic of inclusivity and identity in teaching?
Well, I have a vested interest being part of the LGBTQ community myself. So, that's really the impetus for why I'm interested in it. And, growing up in like a small town in Ontario in the 80s, I have firsthand experience for what it's like not to be represented and not to see yourself, and the sort of damaging effect that can have on one's sense of value. But when I was initially teaching, I didn't really hold the importance of being queer as part of my identity so strongly at the time. And I think that was because, we were conditioned as kids to live in a heteronormative society and to value that and to place an importance on fitting into that. And so I think I was trying to pander to a heteronormative audience, even well into my 20s when I started teaching. But what I did realize was that after I started to get more and more students who identified as LGBTQ, or even one, maybe at the very beginning, I started to realize the power dynamic that's involved in the classroom, especially being a teacher to learners, and how you're always sort of saying, I'm a learner myself, and you're supposed to value that, and you're supposed to like show the learners this. You don't know everything, and you're a model for a wide variety of things, and that extends to your approach to valuing identity. And so I realized a little bit late, if I'm honest, that I am a model for queer students, and as such, I need to do a better job in terms of valuing identity and trying to create practice and pedagogy that does that and includes more students.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Why do you think it's more important nowadays than ever that all teachers recognize and consider these factors when planning and teaching ESL classes? Because, even though, let's say, I'm not directly part of the community, I feel like I have a need to do that as well, and be an ally, as we say nowadays, right? So why do you think that that's important for all teachers to consider that and to incorporate this when they're teaching?
Well, I think it's because, we are all in education, and we all, have a role to play in making our students feel safe and valued and represented. And, for the queer community alone to do this is just impractical, basically. And so I think if we as teachers sort of walk the walk that we talk, and say that we value our students and we foster a safe environment and want to have meaningful language practice activities or opportunities, we all need to sort of work together in order to improve the practices that we do. And especially each of us has, a limited amount of power in this capacity, like we have the power inside our classrooms more or less. And sometimes we have power to help design or buy materials and so on, but we, can't do this alone. And so I would argue that everybody needs to be involved in this practice and should be, just simply because, it's a humane thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important point that you bring up. Like even if you are not part of it directly, your students might be part of that community. And if we feel like we are educators, we need to educate everyone and include everyone. Yeah, that's a great point.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really important, especially, coming in and teaching a class. You don't necessarily know everyone's story, and by building those relationships and getting to know everyone's story, that also helps, I think, with the kind of the bond between fellow students and also between you and the teacher as well. So when we talk about inclusive materials, what exactly are we talking about if we want to get into the real nuts and bolts of it, Tyson?
It's pretty much an approach to the materials so that the students see themselves in the materials or versions of themselves or potential of themselves. And I think when we're talking about young learners, it seems more obvious that seeing gay people or any underrepresented group, quite frankly, and a wide variety of them is a good thing, because you can then see, this is how the world values me. They see a wide variety of different types of LGBTQ people, and I can do a whole bunch of different things. I'm not just, one thing. But even as young adults, or, I teach university age kids, basically, or people, I should say. And at that time, you're just sort of sorting out your identity. You're just starting to figure out who you are and what makes you tick and what you feel comfortable with and so on. And to see that there are successful, or there are, people are going through the same struggles as everybody else, or there are, any kind of situation that's possible instead of just one straight white heteronormative sort of default, makes you realize that you have more potential than maybe you thought initially. So, that's kind of a long-winded sort of answer, I suppose. But what I'm trying to say basically is, inclusive practices is basically being able to see yourself or see potential of yourself in the materials and in the way that the teachers and other learners interact with you, so that you don't feel as though you're pushed into a box or you're silenced or you're invisible, and you can have meaningful language learning activities or discussions or practices about yourself.
Yeah, it makes sense, because we talk so much about personalizing content, right? That's a huge part of learning and of the lesson plan. And if we are not making it personal for everyone, then it's not inclusive.
I think it's good to keep in mind that some teachers who are not queer anyway often don't have in the forefront of their mind is when you can't see in your classroom, obviously, the gay student, you sort of make an assumption that there isn't one necessarily in your class. And you talk about queer people as though there's some outside group and not us, And I think what we should do with any underrepresented group, whether it is about being queer or racialized or an ability issue or body type or whatever it is, we should assume there are people in our class that have these hidden identities, or certainly not ones that are, obvious, and think how our materials represent or don't, or what they say about that group of people, and how, if you were one, how would you feel if you saw what you're teaching or not teaching, basically.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at things too. I hadn't thought of that. Like, just prepare as if you had all these people as part of your audience. Yeah.
Well, and you probably do.
You do.
actually.
Yeah. At one point or another. Yeah. Very true.
Yeah.
This kind of ties into the next thing I wanted to say, which was, especially in Canada and probably a lot of other countries, a lot of our students are international students. So maybe their cultural backgrounds or their upbringings are significantly different to, maybe a Canadian one nowadays. So what are some of the approaches and considerations that teachers can take to start, breaking down those kind of barriers, or maybe I would say bringing awareness to some of these differences that might exist in the classroom?
Well, I think basically you want to go from a kind of organic perspective. I don't want to force
Of course.
a situation. So, I think we want to, if we're planning on the idea that there are minority groups or identities in our classrooms, even if we can't see them, then that's going to impact how you talk about different topics, or what language you bring into the activities, or the materials that you bring in as well. And so each one of those things is going to include, queer identities and Black identities and disabled identities and so on. And so the students aren't going to come from it where you're just saying, hey, today we're going to talk about, gay marriage. That's not what it is, right? It's just these identities and stories and experiences are incorporated into the classroom. And so it's just going to kind of come up in terms of exposure. So I think a good example would be, I designed a sample course book unit a couple of years ago where I was really just trying to show publishers that you can do it. And in it, I had an audio file of a mother of a non-binary child who was at university. And the mother was really just speaking about her child and the struggles her child was having with pressures at university and exam time, and how she didn't get to talk to them very often. And just her use of them and they within this conversation alone was just a very simple and organic way of bringing in a different type of identity. And so the unit isn't focused on pronouns. It's just the pronouns came up. And so I think one way to go about exposing, if you want to call it that, different cultures to, sort of what's normal here, I guess. I'm not even sure that's the right word, but you know what I mean, is just including a variety of people. And that inclusion as a sort of matter of fact, existence is going to say something to the students about, what is valued and who is valued here,
And oftentimes I find that can be even more educational than planning a whole lesson around the topic, because you're not even opening it up for discussion. It's not like, is this right or wrong? Should people be able to use it? No, this is a fact, right? This is a pronoun we use and people can adopt it. And I find myself, and you can let me know if you think that that's a good strategy for other teachers to do as well. Lately, just trying to incorporate, if I'm searching for an image of a couple for a lesson on marriage, I will put a same-sex couple as just illustration for the lesson, not as a point of focus. Or I recently did a lesson on the history of marriage, and the video talked about the history of all kinds of marriages, including same-sex marriage, but not necessarily making the lesson about that, right? So it's just you said, including that representation, I think can be something that a lot of teachers can start with and maybe feel less daunting, right, for them. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, when you look at sort of the simplest approach, which is usualization, it's you kind of look at your input. So the text, the audio, the video, the images that you include. And when you look at them sort of as a whole, what do those things say about the people you value in your classroom or yourself or society in general? And if your answer to that is, straight white people, and that's it, then you're not really doing a very good job at representation.
Right.
Even with gender roles, we notice this with more modern course books, right? You see a picture of a doctor, it's not only a white man. right?
Hopefully, it's not always anyway.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you've just kind of touched on one simple approach. What are some other kind of, not easier, that isn't the right word, but what are some other simple approaches that teachers can use to promote and foster this kind of environment, where all students have equal opportunities? Because as you mentioned before, it might not be, aware, it might not be apparent to the teacher. So how do we kind of create that environment where we have that level of comfort and that level of kind of safety within the classroom? What are some things we can do from that perspective?
Probably at the very beginning, it's worthwhile, like when you're first meeting your students, to like set up, how you set up a kind of class contract sometimes. That can be a good opportunity for you and your class to sort of negotiate expectations of the teacher and of the learners towards respect and tolerance and these kind of things. And that often comes actually in some institutions as an institutional policy to begin with. Like you don't really even have to go through that process. But like at the University of Toronto, we have an inclusivity EDI basically policy that we can just sort of copy and paste. And then we can refer to that throughout the term. But if you don't have that, at whatever context it is that you're teaching, you can create that kind of one at the beginning with your learners. And that gets them invested in the idea of respect and how you communicate with one another. And what do you do if there's a sort of conflict? And so each one of those kind of policies, while it may not seem like it covers representation or EDI, it does really, because if something comes up where there's a conflict or a homophobic remark or something like that, you can refer back to this contract which said everybody agreed you're not going to say things that are disrespectful, or if something hurts some in particular person or ranks someone higher than someone else, you're not going to do that, and this is how you're going to solve that problem. So I would say like that kind of negotiating tactic at the beginning might be good. But otherwise, I do really think it's about educating yourself first. So learning about what type of vocabulary is acceptable to refer to different groups of people, and you do that by asking people like me, or you do that by listening to the people within the community talk about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. It's not just as simple of looking up a website. Sometimes it is, but not always. It takes a little bit of time to learn about a different group of people and how they refer to themselves. So, educating yourself is probably, step number one before you do the contract thing. Right. Even myself, when I was writing the book, how to write inclusive materials, I had to look outside just the queer community to find out, how neurodivergent people or teachers refer to each other, and it was, eye-opening. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to just Google this one thing and then sort of figure it out. I watched a lot of videos. I read a lot of articles. I bookmarked tons and tons of things. And you should see my Chrome bookmarks. There's just so many categories of things nowadays. So that is the sort of put in the work first. But then you really do just look at your materials, I think, and see what it is that your materials are saying about who's valued and who's not valued, and go through it and just add and supplement wherever you can. The usualization approach is probably the easiest to start off with, because stop me if I'm going on too long, but it's about increasing frequency of a wide variety of identities in your materials, so that there isn't just one opportunity to represent a gay male, for example, because when you only have that one opportunity in your materials, you're more likely going to reduce an entire group of people to one representative. And that may be stereotypical or a trope or a not a very nice one, for example, or it might be, the completely whitewashed beige version that is going to appeal to the most people, and certainly not super realistic. So with usualization, the whole point of usualization is to make identities usual, right? That's why it's called that. And so you add in individual queer people with different characteristics and different personalities and different experiences as much as possible alongside everybody else, so that it just becomes, a very common thing to see, and everybody's represented differently. So that's probably the easiest sort of way to start things out, I would say. And if you can't do that, if you can't do that with your materials yourself, or you're not sure even, if your materials are excluding people, then you bring that into the learners as well, and have the learners look through the materials and say, hey, what do these materials say to you about who's important and who's not important?
Right. Yeah.
Do you see yourself and your family in these materials? I mean, chances are some will and some won't. And so, you can get some buy-in from the learners even that way, saying like, why am I seeing like blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people in this family unit when my family, I'm an immigrant here and I don't look anything like them.
Yeah.
Right. So, that's
it can even become a teachable moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that was actually the question I was going to ask you. So about the terms you use in your book, how to write inclusive material. So you talked a little bit now about usualization, making something become more usual, right? And can you tell us a little bit more about disruption that you talk about as well?
Sure. So like disruption is complementary to usualization. I wouldn't consider them two completely separate or isolated approaches. They can work well with each other. Usualization, I think, is one that can apply across all your materials all the time. I'll just give a parallel. Instead of having a unit only on environmentalism, have green aspects to every lesson. Do you know what I mean? And similarly, instead of having one unit be about gay people or pride or whatever it is that you want to talk about, you spread everybody throughout. That's not possible to do and try to focus on a particular characteristic of a group of people. So one criticism of usualization is that you may be sort of ignoring the different experiences of a particular group of people. And that can be erasing as well, So like the fact that queer people have had a different life experience in society than straight people is a fact of society. And to suggest that we're exactly the same as everybody else in every single way is erasure in a sense too. And you're sort of losing an opportunity to talk about this. So a more disruptive approach really focuses on a status quo situation that is creating a barrier for a particular group of people and connecting that barrier to something that everybody can relate to in a sense, so that everybody can then try to fix it or try to change it in some way. So, I mean, that's in a nutshell what a more disruptive approach is. And I'll give an example in a second. But if you think about a metaphor that I use in the book, which is a river, and you think how a river sort of flows, if you imagine that river is flowing with lots of garbage and pollution and so on, that's not so good, right? It just keeps going and going and going. But if you dip your hand into it to pull out a piece of garbage, you're sort of disrupting that flow, right? For the better, right? But one hand isn't really going to do it that much. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. So if you got a whole bunch of people in there pulling garbage out, the flow of the river would be sort of temporarily stopped, at least so that you can, clean it up and so on. And I think the disruptive approach has that kind of similar feeling to it. You're disrupting the flow of what's sort of a status quo, or what's just, if you don't do anything, it's just going to keep going in the same way. So that's sort of why it's called a disruptive approach, I think. But So, but an example of that would be like, if you were talking about how society views non-binary people and how valued society is to non-binary people. And you want to bring in non-binary examples or experiences to show an inequity or, a way in which there's a barrier in society for that group of people. Because, of course, your learners might experience that as well, or you yourself might be in that situation. You would think then of a situation in society where that causes a problem for non-binary people. And one comes to mind, which is public washrooms, for example. So, if you look around public washrooms, you typically see male and female. You might see an all-family one, or an all-gender one. But in any situation, there's still something that is, defining that you go here or you go here or you don't go anywhere, right? And if you're non-binary, you might fit into that I don't go anywhere category. And, if you go into the all-gender one or the all, people might suspect or think one thing or the other. If you go into the female bathroom, because that's the way you present, you might not be accepted there. If you go into the male one, you might not be accepted there. Sometimes you might just hold it and wait until you get home. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of issues that sort of arise. And if you bring in these sort of experiences from a narrative that's authentic, you're not going to create this necessarily, into your classroom, then what you're doing is you're alerting the students to the fact that there is this problem that exists for a group of people. But if you have a student who's non-binary, they might recognize that and go like, oh, finally someone's recognizing that I have this issue. Doesn't mean you're inviting them to speak about it and become the spotlight or anything. It's just you're representing them. And what you want to do then is you want to get the other students to see that there's that problem, and then think, okay, well, what's a problem, kind of similar to that you might face, even if you're not non-binary. And one that comes to mind for me is sort of the ridiculousness of the washroom signs for men and for women sometimes. It's not as serious of a problem, but if you take a look at, how women are depicted on the women's washroom signs, at least it's with a dress, but sometimes it could just be very sexist ones, like, a shopping bag. Right? That's the girls' one, and a football, that's the boys' one. I'm a cisgender man, so I'm gonna go into the male washroom, but I hate football. I don't ever play it. I don't identify with that in any way, shape, or form. And it's not like the bathroom sign is preventing me from going there, but it certainly doesn't represent me. And similarly, there's, a non-binary person also has issues with the washroom. And so we're just trying to make some connection where, there might be a problem for a wider group of people that non-binary people to some degree also face. And so when we see that there's this connection, it sort of gives us a sense of like, okay, well, there's a problem. Let's try to fix it. So let's try to fix the bathroom situation for everybody. One for cisgender people is trying to figure out really how can we make washroom signs, for example, that are, more inclusive. Or for non-binary people and transgender people and everybody, maybe we can just do away with bathrooms like that altogether and figure out another solution that's going to be better. In any case, this is taking a focus on a characteristic of an underrepresented group of people and how that is not being served by society, and trying to find a connection with other people so that we can sort of together use language to talk about ways in which we can solve this problem. So that is a very sort of more detailed, I guess, example of what a disruptive approach is, but it's just one example. So, the bottom line is you look for a status quo that is really not serving a group of people, and you bring in experiences of the underrepresented people that show why it isn't serving that group of people and how harmful it is to their value of themselves. And then you find connections between that and everybody else, and then try to fix it together.
No, it's very clear now, like with that example, I can really get a picture of what we could do in practice, right? Which is
Hopefully,
a big question.
And it's,
Yeah,
it's a really simple way we can involve everyone and get everyone invested in, positive change for everyone. It doesn't have to be about a certain group,
Right.
which is wonderful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're, the other thing about it is that we're using meaningful sort of language learning and practice opportunities, instead of talking about, the latest movie, for example, like this is why limit yourself to only that, students want to talk about things that are more in depth, and, not everybody does, which is why you won't do it every single day, but, not everybody wants to talk about movies or food or whatever,
right?
For a month.
It gets kind of boring after a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Wonderful. It's some really interesting insight, and I've really learned a lot from speaking with you today, Tyson. So where can our listeners find out more about your work and research, your website, social media, etc.?
Yep. So like on social media, I'm pretty prolific, I would say. So it doesn't take that much effort to find me. So if you just Google me, basically you're going to find everything. But I'm at Seburn in every social media, basically, except TikTok. I don't really do TikTok.
No,
I don't think any of us does it.
Well, you never know.
We're not that cool yet. Yeah.
But otherwise, I mean, my website, fourc.ca, is been around forever. It's not updated too often, quite frankly. But I have put another one with the release of the book called path.4c.ca, which is a little sparse at the moment. But what I'm planning to do is give experiences of my own and other people who are underrepresented as a sort of foundation as to why I created the book in the first place and why I thought that was necessary. And in doing so, hopefully put a few lesson plans up there that are shareable and inclusive. And there's one there now at the moment, or two, maybe. Great. Yeah. So that's basically where you can find me.
That's
wonderful.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was, very insightful. And I think our listeners have probably learned a lot as well.
Cool. I hope so. Thanks for inviting me.
Tyson, thanks again for taking the time to share this powerful and relevant element of ESL teaching.
Right. If we can involve our students as much as possible, give them lots of opportunities to express themselves, this will definitely result in more positive experiences for both the student and the teacher. So as always, we would love to hear your feedback. You can get in touch with us on Instagram at ESL Talk Podcast, or you can send us an email to esltalkpodcast@gmail.com.
And also you can join us on Instagram at I'm Daniel Teacher.
Or you can find me at Learning with Faye. Faye is Fey. And we'll see you next week for another new episode of ESL Talk.